About Islamist-related terrorism. This week, the police unveiled another plot for terrorist attacks, but this time they charged 10 people, and they were from the far right. They were far-right extremists, and among them also a former police officer, or a former member of the gendarmerie. Now, what's this story, Sarah?
Well, apparently this group, it's called Operational Forces Action, not a very known terrorist group here in France, but they are, this group has links to this terrorist organization, or whatever you can call it. It urges French people to combat Muslims, or what they call the enemy within. And these people, according to then the police, had plans to hit Muslim targets. In Paris, they had quite a lot of arms that they found in their apartments, thousands of rounds, and even some kind of instructions to create explosives. The actual how this terror attack was going to actually be executed is not really clear. It's an ill-defined terrorist plot. But still, it shows that it reminds us, I must say, that terrorism is absolutely not only a question about Islamist terrorism, and that the Muslim inhabitants of this country are also very much a target, must say. And it's also a fact that the number of attacks against Muslims in the country has gone up over the last years.
Yeah, and the suspects included a retired police officer who was the alleged leader of the group, but also a former soldier. So it shows that even in the ranks of the state services, there are, you could call them radical elements.
I'm just wondering how this would have been reported if it had been Islamist terrorism we were talking about. Would the way that media had reported about this and how the government would have had acted, would it been different if it would have been then Islamist terrorist elements within police force, for example?
Yeah, I think so, because actually the French media did not really talk about terrorist attacks or terrorists. They talked about extremists planning attacks on Muslims. So it shows how sensitive the use of the word terrorist is. But of course, it's always, if it's a Muslim, it's a terrorist. If it's a Christian, it's usually a deranged person,
yes,
something
exactly.
like that.
In this case, at least the police were talking about a terrorist.
Yeah.
And the investigators were talking about a terrorist attack.
But the media were very reluctant to use the word terrorist.
Yes, and even it's interesting also to see, because we have been reporting over the last years about a lot of these kind of plots that have been unveiled by the authorities, and quite often the proofs that they are actually providing the public with are quite bad, I must say. So I remember one case recently where some guys had been keeping instructions for some kind of creating a bomb or something on their computer. It's not a plot that has gone very far in its preparations. But in this case, it's actually, we have real arms, we have rounds, we have almost explosives, and clearly a motive.
Yeah, and on their website of this shadowy Operational Forces Action, you can see an apocalyptic battle scene under the Eiffel Tower. They claim to prepare the French citizen soldiers for the combat on national territory. And these are images you can also find on sites of ISIS, for instance. So
yes, and we shouldn't forget that anti-Muslim violence has gone up in France. Last year was 72 violent acts reported to police, and that's up from 67 in 2016. Now, to another kind of terrorism and terror threatening France, apparently. Stéphane, you've heard about this?
Yes, and it's also, at the same time, our regular food item. It's actually another kind of terror threat. It's the invasion of the body snatchers. At least according to some of its butchers, they are afraid of vegans.
Yes.
There have been some incidents the last couple of weeks.
There has been incidents. Some butcher shops in the north of France has been vandalized by what is said to be militant extremist vegans. Apparently some fake blood has been poured on some of these shops, and windows have been smashed, etc. So this led to a very serious letter from the butchers' union, so butchers' organization, to the interior minister himself.
Yeah, and the butchers, they sharpen their knives and they ask for protection because they're afraid that it will escalate, that the vegans, as they call them, is not sure who's really behind this, because nobody's got arrested so far. But the butchers are really afraid of the vegans, and they are especially afraid that the violence will escalate and that there will be victims. Now, there was also an intellectual battle, of course. This is France, after all. People defending vegans, and also people, vegans themselves, who say, well, this is actually very bad publicity for us.
It is interesting because it comes in, being a vegetarian myself, the thing is that vegetarianism is not very big in France.
No.
Probably, among with Spain and Italy, I would say some of the countries in Europe with the lowest numbers of vegans and vegetarians. So it's less than, I think, 2% of the population that consider themselves vegetarian, not even vegan. Vegan, I don't think we don't even have numbers on that. But it's a very, very infected question. And what you can really feel is this fear within the meat industry for this growing monster of vegetarianism.
Yeah, because it will cost them, if meat consumption is going down. And
it goes down. I would say not only because of vegetarians and vegans, but because of flexitarians, which is what it's called, where people actually start thinking about, for environmental reasons, their meat consumption. So a lot of people say that, trying to eat less meat, maybe only a couple of times a week, for example. But of course, this is a threat to an industry. And we can see a very, very heated debate here in France between the adamant defenders of the meat culture and then, those saying that, we should maybe try to cut down a little bit on the meat consumption. And there has been discussions about putting in place a non-meat day in the school canteens. And this has also been very, very opposed by some forces, and especially then the meat industry here in France.
Yeah, I think it also has to do with identity. In France, you eat. That's one of the main reasons to live, and usually you eat meat as well.
Yes.
Almost all
absolutely
meals.
It's part of the national identity.
Yeah, and if you go to a restaurant in France and you want to have a vegetarian dish, they will give you a salad. Although it is changing.
It is changing, and I can tell from my own experience that when I moved to France almost 15 years ago, it was more or less impossible to get a proper vegetarian dish unless you went to an Italian restaurant. That's completely different today. In almost all restaurants, you will have a vegetarian suggestion. People are aware that if you say you're vegetarian, that doesn't mean that you eat poultry, for example. Things that, it was just this big ignorance some years ago. So things are changing, and more people do become vegetarian, but not at all if you compare it with the northern European countries, for example, where vegetarianism really has, been impregnated in the societies. France is not quite there yet, and I think there's a quite long way to go.
Now, this weekend it's going to be sunny and warm in Paris, and these are the perfect conditions for the annual Paris Pride, the Marché des Fiertés LGBT, the big festival in Paris. And it actually started a little bit already this week.
Yes, the neighborhood around the Marais, especially, which is the LGBT neighborhood here in France, has been painted in rainbow flags over the last week already. Flags in the streets and flags on the streets.
Yes, indeed. Pedestrian crossings were painted in the rainbow colors. It all looked very happy. It was very nice. But not everybody liked the colorful pedestrian crossings. And
no, and they were earlier this week. Then some of these rainbow flags were actually vandalized by people, and there was a tagging of gay people should not have the right to be in Paris. It was quite a nasty night that they went through. But this is a classical story of what comes around goes around, we probably could say.
Absolutely, because everybody was shocked by the fact that there were slogans on the street against homosexuals and LGBT people. But then actually the Paris town hall, they said, okay, you can have your cake, but we will eat it, because from now on, the pedestrian crossings in the Marais will be permanently in the rainbow colors. So that's actually a very nice gesture of the city's mayor. From now on, they will be permanent. So if you go out in the Marais, you will cross the streets and go to all the wonderful bars and restaurants there, walking on rainbow flags. Now that wraps up this edition of So French. We hope you have enjoyed it. Please follow us on Twitter at SoFrenchNews. And if you have any questions or suggestions, please send us an email. Our address is sofrench@sofrench.news.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast in iTunes or in the TuneIn radio application, and to share the podcast with your friends. You can also listen to all our previous podcasts in iTunes.
And if you like French music, check out our playlist on Spotify, which we update regularly. Just search for So French Podcast or click the link on our website.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks, and all summer we will have special editions for you with a lot of wonderful guests. We're kicking off on 14 juillet, the 14th of July, and France's national holiday, with writer Stephen Clark.
And we hope you'll join us then. Thanks for listening. Au revoir.